Welcome to Echoes of War. In today's video, we will be sharing a historical biblical story of a battle and siege. Let's dive into the video and see what Elijah dealt with. Enjoy.
All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're looking at a genuinely fascinating military case study from the 9th century BC, straight out of the ancient text of 2 Kings. You know, we usually read these historical texts looking for moral lessons, right? But today, we're going to flip the script and analyze this from a purely tactical and military standpoint. We're looking at a major geopolitical conflict between the Kingdom of Aram, which is modern-day Syria, and the Kingdom of Israel. But I gotta tell you, this isn't your standard story of two armies just clashing on a muddy battlefield. It is a wild story about top-tier intelligence gathering, overwhelming force, and a highly unconventional defense strategy that literally rewrites the rules of engagement.
To really get into this, we have to ask the big question that drives this whole narrative. What happens when an entire empire's army is deployed to capture just one man? Seriously, think about that. In military history, high-value targets are usually political leaders, maybe top-ranking generals. But here, the target is a single prophet named Elisha. To wrap our heads around why an entire military apparatus was mobilized for one unarmed guy, we really need to understand the absolute tactical nightmare he was causing for the enemy forces.
Phase 1 of this conflict is all about the ancient intelligence war.
What is absolutely mind-blowing here is the speed of information. Check this out. The Aramean king spends days, maybe even weeks, carefully planning a covert ambush against Israel. But then, within a matter of hours, Elisha the prophet leaks the exact coordinates of the Aramean camp to the king of Israel. And because of this perfectly timed intel, the Israelite army could just evade the trap in minutes. Elisha was basically functioning as a one-man early warning radar system, completely neutralizing the Aramean military's offensive capabilities time and time again.
So the resulting tension in the Aramean camp is incredible. On one side, you've got the Aramean king's absolute paranoia. I mean, he is furious. He calls his officers together and demands to know who the traitor is. He is 100% convinced there's a highly placed mole in his ranks. But on the other side, we get the tactical reality. His officers flat out tell him, there is no spy. The problem is Elisha. One of the officers actually says that Elisha tells the king of Israel the very words the Aramean king speaks in the privacy of his own bedroom. Talk about a breach. From a military standpoint, Aram's operational security was compromised on a supernatural level.
Which leads us directly into Phase 2, the siege of Dothan. Frustrated by this unstoppable intelligence leak, the king completely shifts his strategy. He stops trying to attack the Israelite army and decides to just cut the head off their intelligence network. He finds out Elisha's in the city of Dothan, and he mobilizes a massive strike force. We're not talking about a small squad of assassins here. He deploys a huge army with horses and chariots, which, by the way, was the heavy armor of the ancient world. They execute a textbook night operation, marching under the cover of darkness to keep the element of surprise, and they achieve a complete encirclement of the city. Tactically, it was flawless. They cut off every single supply line and escape route. Elisha was totally trapped.
So you can completely understand the sheer, unadulterated panic of Elisha's servant. The poor guy wakes up early the next morning, steps outside, and realizes they are totally boxed in. The text tells us he sees the troops, the horses, the heavy chariots just everywhere. And his response is total despair. Alas, my master, what shall we do? From a human military calculation, the math was just devastating. You've got thousands of heavily armed soldiers on one side versus one prophet and his servant on the other. Surrender or death really seemed to be the only two options on the table.
But Elisha doesn't panic. Welcome to Phase 3, the unseen counteroffensive.
Elisha remains perfectly calm, looks right at his terrified servant, and drops this incredible line. Do not be afraid, for those who are with us are more than those who are with them. Now, from a strategic standpoint, Elisha is claiming overwhelming numerical superiority. He's stating, just as a matter of fact, that his defending forces actually outnumber the massive visible enemy army currently laying siege to the city. I mean, to any rational observer standing in that courtyard facing thousands of enemy troops, he probably sounded completely delusional.
But Elisha doesn't argue with his servant. He just prays. He says, "O Lord, please open his eyes that he may see." He's asking for his servant's spiritual eyes to be open to the true tactical situation on the ground, a reality of the battlefield that was totally invisible to human sight.
And when the servant looks up, the true power dynamic is completely revealed. When you compare these two forces, it's not even close. Aram's earthly army relied on conventional weapons, heavy chariots, and visible strength. But God's heavenly host literally covered the entire mountainside with horses and chariots of fire.
The Arameans thought they had surrounded Elisha, but God's army had already surrounded them. The invisible forces vastly outnumbered and outgunned the earthly military. It wasn't even a contest, guys. The army that ultimately prevailed was already in position.
With the real power dynamic exposed, we enter Phase 4, a tactical show of mercy.
The text lays out exactly how this vastly superior heavenly army engaged the Arameans. Now, conventional military wisdom says when you have a massive advantage in firepower, you annihilate the enemy. But what happens here is wildly different. It's a masterclass in psychological warfare and mercy, and it happens without a single casualty. First, as the enemy advances, Elisha prays for them to be struck with blindness. And this wasn't necessarily losing their physical eyesight, but rather a deep psychological confusion. They literally didn't know where they were. Step 2, Elisha confidently walks right up to the army sent to capture him, tells them they're on the wrong road, and leads them away. He marches this disoriented army about 10 to 12 miles right into Samaria, the heavily fortified capital of Israel. Step 3, once they're inside the walls and totally surrounded by the Israelite army, their sight is restored. They realize they've marched straight into a trap. And finally, step 4, they are disarmed, not with weapons, but with a massive feast. Notice the stark contrast in leadership here. The king of Israel looks at this captured enemy army, and his conventional military instinct kicks into high gear. He asks Elisha, "Shall I kill them, my father?" He is ready to execute the prisoners of war and end the threat permanently. But Elisha intervenes with a highly unconventional, compassionate strategy. He tells the king, "No, you didn't capture them with your own sword or bow. Set food and water before them." He commands the king to treat them as honored guests, feed them, and send them straight back to their master.
Now, from a military perspective, you'd probably think releasing an entire army would just let them regroup and attack you again later, right? But the text reveals this psychological victory was a massive strategic success. The narrative concludes that the bands from Aram stopped raiding Israel's territory. By showing unexpected grace and proving that Israel's God had completely outmatched them in force and strategy, Elisha broke the Aramean army's morale and will to fight way more effectively than a slaughter ever could have.
So, to wrap up our explainer today, I want to leave you with this really provocative thought from the source material. We've analyzed the troop numbers, the intelligence tactics, and the vast superiority of the unseen forces that prevailed on that mountain. But if the ultimate victory here, the very act that actually stopped the wars and raids, was secured with a feast of bread and water rather than the swing of a sword, what does that teach us about true power? Sometimes, understanding that we are protected by unseen forces doesn't just free us from fear, it actually frees us to show mercy to those who stand against us.